Hello, bros. We're back with Herzl, as I remember him, by Erwin Rosenberger. Rosenberger. It's a 1958 book about the founder of Zionism. 1959 book. I forgot to look up the novel that Herzl wrote. I would like to get it. This book tells the plan that the Zionists wanted to take over Palestine, and they did. 31. Herzl and I were standing in Bergmann's print shop one day, watching as page after page of Die Welt issued in the stately procession from the press. Herzl gazed for a time at the rhythmic movements of the machine, glanced around the press room, and then turned to me with the remark, Zionism is Attila in reverse. Wherever it sets foot, shoots burst from the ground. Of King Attila, whose Huns had once laid waste much of Europe, it was said that no blade of grass grew again where his horse had set foot. Herzl's words referred to the print shop of Sigmund Bergmann, to which Die Welt had taken its business in February 1898. Bergmann, a Jew, had just moved to Vienna from Reichenberg in Bohemia. His industry shop was located at number 11 Schlosselgasse. At first, business had been slow. Once Die Welt became his customer, however, Bergmann began to prosper. He received orders from the Zionist Action Committee, from various Zionist societies, etc., and he was able to enlarge his establishment. Among other things, the industry shop printed the official record of the Zionist Congress, Herzl's pamphlet Der Basler Congress, dealing with the First Congress, and the book editions of his drama Das New Ghetto, The New Ghetto, and his comedy Unser Katchen, Our Katie, as well as the stock certificates and prospectus of the Jewish Colonial Trust. As far as Bergmann's print shop was concerned, therefore, it could indeed be said that Zionism had proved to be Attila in reverse. Another time, as we were watching the printing press do its work, what do you got, bruv? Herzl pointed to the pages coming out. You see that black spot there, he said? That little round thing can sometimes help ruin a newspaper publisher. He was speaking of the printed newspaper stamp. At that time, all periodicals had to pay a tax for permission to appear. A survival from the days when governments had imposed all sorts of restrictions on the press. The newspaper stamp showed that the tax had been paid. For its first few years, Die Welt, oh man, like other Austrian papers, carried the round printed symbol on its first page. Next to the title, the Austrian double eagle with the words Imperial Newspaper Stamp. Among his other contributions to the new Free Press, Herzl wrote humorous fillers for the Sunday edition, which appeared in the news columns rather than in the feuilleton section. These brief items, which were often choice specimens of Herzlian wit, were always signed with a pseudonym, such as Coons or XY local reporter. One day, I said to Herzl, it's a shame these fillers don't carry your signature instead of just a pen name. Impossible, he replied. What would blank and blank and blank say? And he named several prominent foreign Zionists. If they saw my name signed to those jokes, I can't afford to be seen playing the wag. And so the author's vanity had to yield to the Zionist leader's prestige. What's up, bros? During the time I worked under him, Herzl rarely assumed the role of mentor. The few journalistic tips he gave me came, for the most part, in my first months on Die Welt. Learn to avoid the lyrical tone, he said to me once in his well meaning, friendly tone. It was one of the qualities that lent charm to his feuilletons. What he meant was that lyricism might seem out of place in a largely political paper like ours, and yet perhaps I could be pardoned for feeling that Die Welt, which throbbed with longing for the land of biblical legend, for the fields through which the Jordan flows, and where Ruth once stood amid the alien corn, had as much of lyricism as of politics in it. One should not strain for a joke, Herzl said to me another time. It will come by itself. Once, when we were working on Die Welt in the Burggasse, he took a bright blue covered paper-bound book off the shelf and handed it to me with the jocular warning, don't use it as a model. It was his own Buch der Narrheit, Book of Folly, a 266-page collection of gay sketches and stories published in 1888. Herzl's wife, who was present, seemed astonished at this disparagement of a book which she thought highly and had enjoyed reading. By contrast with Der Judenstaat, however, the Buch der Narrheit seemed to its author an utterly insignificant work. On another occasion, Herzl offered me the advice, read Tacitus. I nodded my head but said nothing. The reason for this lack of enthusiasm was a curious one. Lodged in some recess of my memory was a passage I had once read which had gravely shaken my faith in the great Roman historian's credibility. As I recalled, Tacitus had made the absurd assertion that the Jews in their temples worshipped an ass. Hence, I accepted Herzl's advice with thanks but made no effort to act on it. Herzl also advised me once, in the forceful tone he sometimes adopted in such matters, read the letters of Junius. He was referring to a famous series of political letters of still unknown authorship, which appeared in a London newspaper in 1769 through 1772 under the pseudonym Junius. It so happened that I had a German translation in my library, which I had glanced at occasionally but never really read. Here again, however, Herzl's advice fell on barren soil. I never did take the time to read Junius. 32. In the summer of 1899, Herzl was in Holland. During May, June, and July, The Hague was, or is it The Hague? The Hague was the scene of an international peace conference. A conference resulting from the spectacular appeal by Tsar Nicholas II, which had had such an explosive effect at the Second Zionist Congress the previous summer. Herzl's purpose in journeying to the Dutch capital was to establish contacts with Russian statesmen attending the conference. This he hoped to achieve with the aid of Baroness Suttner, a noted Austrian pacifist and author, and a sincere friend of the Jewish people. Through the Russian delegates at The Hague, he hoped then to gain access to government ministers in St. Petersburg, and perhaps even the Tsar himself. His object in all this was twofold: to prevail upon the Tsar to take the Zionist movement under his protection and to obtain relief for the 4,500,000 Russian Jews, most of whom led an utterly wretched existence. The Hague Conference also provided an excellent opportunity for propaganda on behalf of the Jewish state idea. Here, too, Baroness Suttner could be very helpful, and Herzl spared no expense to achieve the desired end. In May, the hell away from me, fly. In May, while still in Vienna, look at this guy. He wrote in his diary, Baroness Suttner wrote to me, asking that I intercede at the new Free Press to have her sent to the peace conference at The Hague, worth a contribution of 1,000 florins. The publishers would not do it. I then offered her 1,000 florins to go for Die Welt and interview the main people at the conference on behalf of Zionism. She accepted. Thus, we have brought Zionism before the assembled powers of Europe without offending Turkey and infringing on her rights. I plan to go to The Hague myself in June and try to make the peacemakers' acquaintance in Baroness Suttner's drawing room. 1,000 florins was a substantial sum of money, but Herzl never stinted when it was a question of advancing the Zionist cause. Indeed, not long afterward, in August 1899, he wrote in his diary that his personal expenditures on behalf of Zionism had already exceeded 50,000 florins. The idea to which he had dedicated himself was carrying him perilously close to financial ruin. Before leaving for The Hague, Herzl asked to divulge his address only in the most urgent cases, since he did not want to be bothered with letters, in addition to all the personal contacts he hoped to make in the Dutch capital. He had to draft a speech to be delivered later in London. While in The Hague, Herzl stayed at the Hotel Kurhaus, an expensive establishment in the well-known North Sea resort of Scheveningen. His social and literary position normally required him to maintain a certain standard of living, and in this case he had to be particularly careful in his choice of lodgings. He had come to Holland with the intention of mingling on equal terms with statesmen and diplomats, as spokesman for a movement which hoped to buy an entire province from the Sultan of Turkey, and which, at that very moment, was engaged in founding a bank and hence was seeking substantial credits. Under the circumstances, he could scarcely put up at some second-class inn. On his very first day in The Hague, Herzl was introduced by Baroness Suttner to a prominent Russian, Johann von Bloch, a member of the advisory committee of the Ministry of France. Born into a Warsaw Jewish family, Bloch had made a career as an industrialist and an economist, which had brought him high in the personal favor of the Tsar. He was the author of a 4-volume work, Russia's Finances, as well as a 6-volume study entitled War, which was pacifistic in tendency. At the time Herzl met him, Bloch was 63. He had converted to Christianity many years before. When at length Herzl brought the conversation around to Zionism, Bloch promised that, if the circumstances were favorable, he would try to obtain an audience with the Tsar for Herzl. He also declared that it might be possible to induce the Tsar to issue a rescript favoring Zionism. Thus, Herzl's journey to The Hague had not been without result. On June 17th, Herzl left for Paris. His London speech, which he hoped would bring added support for the movement, and especially for the new bank, the Jewish Colonial Trust, was scheduled for the end of the month. It was to be merely a standard speech, and Herzl expressed it as Herzl expressed it, but not a word of it was as yet down on paper. The Hague, with the excitement of the conference and the soirees at Baronet Suttner's, had scarcely been the place for Herzl to collect his thoughts. Fortunately, however, he knew of a quiet retreat which had already proved its worth as a stimulus to literary creation. The Hotel Castille in Paris, where 4 years before he had written Der Judenstaat. Among other things, Herzl visited an automobile show while in Paris. His interest was partly personal, for he had once told me that he hoped to own a small car when a moderate priced one became available. Like everything else he thought and did, however, the visit was also linked with the great consuming mission of his life, Zionism. He was intensely interested in the rapid advance of modern transportation, to which he had already assigned an important role in the future Jewish state. In London, Herzl found obstacles to be overcome and various irksome complications. In the end, however, his efforts were crowned with success. On June 28th, I received a wire from the British capital. If no wire to contrary, if no wire to contrary by tomorrow, what the hell does that mean? If no wire to contrary by tomorrow noon, please print following dispatch, boldface. Board of Directors has decided to proceed to allotment of shares. Thus, our bank has definitely been founded. I could well imagine the joy and relief with which Herzl had written the last sentence. Train hears it too. Thus, our bank. All right. Thus, our bank has definitely been founded. The Jewish Colonial Trust was a vital new step toward the creation of a Jewish state, which would further discomfit the scoffers and breathe new confidence into our supporters. And it might be added, Herzl had contributed not only his usual tireless energy, but also a substantial sum of money to its founding. The bank's prospectus, statements, subscription appeals, etc., stressed that it had been established as the financial instrument through which the ideas of Zionism are to be put into practice. One statement cited as one of its purposes the acquisition of land for the founding of new settlements on a publicly and juridically secured basis. The bank's capital amounted to £2 million, divided among 2 million shares of stock valued at £1 each. The 20-odd member board of directors was, of course, headed by Herzl. The prospectus made it clear that the founders' shares issued to the members of the board would not provide a source of profit. They merely enabled the board to exercise legal control over the bank's affairs and see to it that the objectives of Zionism, for whose furtherance and development the company, i.e., bank, was founded, are always kept in the foreground. Herzl was almost painfully concerned with avoiding any suspicion that he wished to turn Zionism to his own material advantage. And we know that the material fruits of his Zionist endeavors were the steady deterioration of his financial position. Several days after the joyful news about the bank, I received another wire from Herzl, which filled me with foreboding. Not that the message itself was in any way disturbing. It announced that he would arrive in Vienna on the morning of July 10th and provided more encouraging information about the bank. What troubled me was the name of the town from which the telegram had been sent, Bad Nauheim. Bad Nauheim was best known as a place where cardiac cases went for treatment. I was thunderstruck. Could it be that Herzl was suffering from a heart condition? Impossible. To me, he had always been the very symbol of perfection, physical perfection, as well as every other kind. I consulted in a reference book and was relieved to find that Bad Nauheim was noted for the treatment of rheumatic and dermatological as well as cardiac disorders. Obviously, Herzl had gone there merely for a touch of rheumatism. If it had been anything serious, he would hardly be returning to Vienna so soon. Then, when he made his appearance at Die Welt on July 10th, my last doubts were allayed. It was the old Herzl. He was in a good humor and accepted my congratulations on his London triumph. with the familiar Herzl smile, that smile which seemed to betray just a hint of superiority to everything that was transpiring on this planet of ours. Yet, just a few weeks earlier, Herzl had made an entry in his diary which told a very different story from that which I thought I read on his smiling face. Paris, June 19th, at the Hotel Castille. For sentiment's sake, I am staying again at the old house where 4 years ago I wrote Der Judenstaat. What a road I have traveled since then, and what weariness there has been. My heart is very fatigued. I suffer from constriction and arrhythmia. Thus, the heart which had so long beat in sympathy with millions of oppressed Jews was now in a physical condition which would have aroused the sympathy and concern of all of us had we but known. I don't know whether I was insufficiently observant, whether I saw only what I wished to see, or whether it was Herzl who deliberately feigned perfect health. At all events, it never occurred to me that he was anything but his usual active, vigorous, robust self. Herzl never uttered a word to suggest that he was in failing health, or even that he was tired. I recall only two occasions on which he referred to his physical state at all. Once he came into the office and remarked, I have a terrific cold. It got me positively groggy. It's got me positively groggy. Another time he said good humoredly, slowly moving his shoulders as though to test them, I can hardly move today. I played tennis too long, and the day before yesterday. That was all, and yet we know now that he had far more to complain of than a bad cold and aching muscles. Herzl wrote a feuilleton for the New Free Press, dealing with his impressions of Bad Nauheim. Yes, it was difficult to say whether the author had been a patient, and if so, what kind, or merely an observer who had chanced to pass through. I gladly seized upon the more optimistic interpretation, and before long the momentarily alarming telegram from Nauheim had completely vanished from my mind. Rarely has a man spared himself as little in the service of a cause as Herzl did, while at the same time he spared his colleagues even the slightest disquiet by resolutely concealing the true state of his health. Now, a few words about Baroness Bertha von Suttner, whose name occurs at the beginning of this chapter. Born Countess Kinsky, a member of a Bohemian noble family, she was an ardent pacifist and president of the Austrian Society of Friends of Peace. In 1889, her novel Die Waffen nieder, Down Arms, attracted wide attention. She was 56 years old at the time of the Hague Peace Conference. With her husband, Baron A. Gundaker, Gundaker von Suttner, who was also a writer, she lived in Harmansdorf Castle near Eggenberg in Lower Austria. As president of the Society for the Prevention of Anti-Semitism, Baron Suttner fought a brave, though hopeless, battle against the forces of organized bigotry in Austria. In an era when his only reward could be the scorn and abuse of his co-religionists, he and his wife spoke up publicly on behalf of the Jewish people. Both were contributors to Die Welt. Among my papers is a letter which Baroness Suttner wrote to Herzl on June 10th, 1897, most of which was published in our third issue. In it, she said, the sample issue of Die Welt and all that you are doing inspires great respect in me. It shows courage, candor, clarity, a deep, firm will, with eyes fixed upon something great and useful. My feelings towards you and Zionism are like yours toward me and the peace movement. Respect and doubt. One bids the boat Godspeed, but one cannot, must not, go along, for on both sides the oarsmen must give no less than their all. I would have to study the matter before I could presume to say anything about it. One can do harm, after all, by voicing doubts which stem from inadequate comprehension. In any case, only an accurate, qualified judgment is actually helpful. Then Baroness Suttner made plain what her doubts were, and I really don't know whether assimilation might not be better than founding a new state and nationality. It was typical of Herzl's tolerant approach that he published this non Zionist view in Die Welt. From this letter, we learn what Herzl's attitude was toward pacifism and the striving for eternal peace, respect, and doubt. Once in Reichenau, when we were discussing these matters, he said to me, shaking his head, "It will be a long time before we see eternal peace, but the Jewish state will already be there, eternal." He was wrong about that. The Reverend Heckler would probably have said, "First must come the kingdom of Israel, as prophesied, then the age of eternal peace will follow." Bertha von Suttner subsequently became a warm advocate of Zionism. In Die Welt's issue number 21 for the year 1899, she expressed her feelings as follows: as salvation from misery and persecution, as proud rebellion against unheard of insults, and above all, as the creation of a place of refuge. That is how I now see the establishment of the Kingdom of Zion. In 1905, Baroness Suttner was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She died barely a month before the outbreak of World War I. Thus, she did not live to see the tragic failure of her life's work, just as Herzl did not live to see the full fruition of his. I'm going to stop there because the next chapter is really long, and I don't feel like reading 10 more pages, 12 more pages. So that's going to be it. Herzl.